At 9:51 a.m. on July 23, 2007, the phone rang at a Bank of America branch in Cheshire, Connecticut. The voice on the other end was urgent but controlled. It was a bank teller. She was requesting immediate police assistance. A woman had just walked in, visibly shaking, her voice barely above a whisper. Jennifer Hochpatee. She had been instructed to withdraw $15,000. Not for herself. Not by choice. The teller didn't know who the men outside were. She didn't know what they were capable of. But the look in Jennifer's eyes, pure terror, told her everything. She stalled, dragging out the transaction. She kept Jennifer engaged, asking careful questions, her fingers trembling as she pressed the silent alarm. But Jennifer couldn't wait. She took the cash. She turned. And she walked out of the bank. At that moment, no one inside that branch knew what was happening just 3 miles away, behind the doors of a quiet suburban home. No one knew that inside the Patee family's house, a nightmare was already unfolding. A nightmare that would not have a happy ending. Hours earlier, as the rest of Cheshire slept, 2 men sat in a dark car, parked just down the street. Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes. Strangers to the Patee family. Men with no connection to this home, no reason to be there, except for one. They had made a decision. A quiet one. A simple one. They were going to take whatever they wanted. And they weren't going to leave witnesses. The neighborhood was still. A porch light flickered. A dog barked once in the distance. Then silence. The Patee family, Dr. William Patee, his wife Jennifer, and their 2 daughters, Michaela and Haley, were inside, sound asleep. The world outside was safe. Or at least, it should have been. It was just after 3 a.m. when the men stepped out of their car, their movements practiced, methodical. They didn't hesitate. They didn't speak. A basement door, unlocked. An easy entry. Dr. William Patee stirred in his sleep, unaware of the figures moving through his home. He didn't hear the whisper of footsteps on the wooden floor. He didn't hear the faint shuffle of fabric as zip ties were prepared. But he did feel the first blow. A baseball bat to the head. Then another. And another. He gasped, pain blinding, but he wasn't given time to process it. His arms were yanked behind his back, wrists bound. His ankles, too. He was dragged down the stairs, left in the basement. Bleeding. Barely conscious. Helpless. Upstairs, Jennifer and the girls were still asleep. But not for long. What happened inside that house over the next 7 hours is something few can comprehend. The Patee family had no enemies. No dark secrets. No reason to be targeted. And yet, their home had been transformed into a prison. Their safety, their security, ripped away in an instant. Outside, the sun was rising. The town was waking up. Neighbors were stepping outside for their morning jogs. Cars were pulling out of driveways. Birds chirped. The world continued as if nothing was wrong. But inside the Patee home, a mother was being forced to make an impossible choice. A father lay in the basement, slipping in and out of consciousness, with no way of knowing what was happening to his family. And 2 young girls, 2 innocent children, had their lives hanging in the balance. This is the story of the Cheshire home invasion. A crime so brutal, so incomprehensible, that even hardened investigators struggled to process what they found. A crime that would leave an entire town haunted. And a crime that, no matter how much time has passed, can never truly be forgotten. Cheshire, Connecticut. A town of tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and homes filled with families who believed they were safe. A place where doors were left unlocked, where children rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on, where crime, real crime, was something that happened somewhere else. And in the middle of this quiet, picturesque town was the Patee family. Dr. William Patee, a man known not only for his expertise as an endocrinologist but for his kindness, his unwavering dedication to his patients, and his love for his family. His wife, Jennifer Hochpatee, a devoted nurse, spent her days caring for those in need and her nights cherishing every moment with her daughters. Their oldest, Haley, 17 years old, had just graduated from Miss Porter's school. She was set to attend Dartmouth in the fall. A natural leader, a fierce competitor on the varsity crew team, a young woman with a future so bright, so full of potential. And then there was Michaela. 11 years old, sweet, thoughtful, with a love for cooking. That night she had prepared a special dinner, pasta with her mother's favorite sauce, wanting to do something kind, something simple, something that, in her young heart, was an act of love. They were a family like any other. But on the night of July 22nd, 2007, everything changed. What began as a peaceful Sunday evening, filled with ordinary moments, laughter, the simple comfort of home, would soon turn into a night of unimaginable horror. Because as they locked their doors and settled in for the night, two men were already watching. Waiting. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, nothing would ever be the same. It was a warm summer night. The streets of Cheshire were quiet, porch lights glowing, curtains drawn, families asleep in their beds. But while the rest of the town rested, two men sat in a dark car, their engine idling. Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes. Two strangers. Two criminals with a history of theft, burglary, and violence. And that night, they weren't just looking for a house to rob. They were looking for something more. Hours earlier, Jennifer Hawkpatee and her youngest daughter, Michaela, had stopped at the local grocery store. A routine trip. A mother and daughter picking up a few last-minute items, chatting as they wandered the aisles. They had no way of knowing they were being watched. Komisarjevsky was inside that store too. He didn't approach them. He didn't speak. But he saw something in them, something that made him choose them. It could have been anyone, any house, any family. But at that moment, Jennifer and Michaela became his targets. He followed them to the parking lot. He watched as they loaded groceries into their car. And as Jennifer pulled out onto the main road, he and Hayes followed. For 3 miles, their car stayed just out of sight, trailing them through the quiet, winding roads of Cheshire. Then, Jennifer's turn signal blinked. She pulled into her driveway. Komisarjevsky and Hayes kept driving. But they would be back. They parked down the street waiting. Watching the lights in the house go off one by one. Studying the way the shadows moved through the windows. And then, when the town was deep in sleep, when the world outside was silent, they made their move. It was just after 3 a.m. Dr. William Patee was asleep on the couch in the sunroom, a cool breeze drifting in through the open windows. Upstairs, Jennifer and the girls were in their rooms, tucked into bed, unaware of the danger that was creeping toward them. Komisarjevsky and Hayes moved quickly, silently. They had done this before, breaking into homes, creeping through the dark, taking what they wanted. A basement door. Unlocked. They slipped inside. Dr. Patee stirred slightly but didn't wake. He never heard them approach. Never saw the baseball bat raised high above his head. The first blow was sudden. Sharp. A flash of pain. Then another. Blood. Confusion. Darkness. Dr. Patee collapsed. His body was dragged down the basement stairs. His hands and feet were bound. His head was pounding. His vision blurred. And upstairs, his wife and daughters slept on. Jennifer was the next to wake. A rough hand over her mouth. The sharp pull of zip ties tightening around her wrists. The feeling of cold metal pressing against her skin. Michaela, just down the hall, felt it too. The sudden weight of a stranger in her room. The whisper of something being taken from her that could never be returned. Haley. Still asleep. But not for long. The intruders had full control now. A family that had gone to bed in safety had woken up in terror. And their nightmare was just beginning. Because what happened next is beyond comprehension. For the next 7 hours, the Patee family endured what can only be described as pure terror. They were no longer in their home. They were captives in a place that had once been safe, subjected to the cruel whims of two men who had no intention of letting them go. Dr. William Patee lay in the basement, barely conscious. His head throbbed from the repeated blows of the baseball bat, his wrists and ankles bound so tightly that every movement sent searing pain through his body. He could hear voices above him. The muffled sounds of footsteps. Crying. The occasional rustling of fabric. But he was powerless to stop what was happening. Upstairs, Jennifer, Michaela, and Haley were tied to their beds, unable to move. Strips of fabric, rope, and zip ties dug into their skin. Their captors moved between rooms, whispering in low tones, making decisions that would soon seal their fate. It became clear early on that Joshua Komisarjevsky had fixated on Michaela. He entered her room repeatedly, speaking in a quiet voice, reassuring her in ways that were anything but comforting. The way he looked at her, the way he hovered, it was something Jennifer could sense even from the next room. She pleaded with him, begged him to stop, but Komisarjevsky ignored her. Meanwhile, Stephen Hayes had a different plan. One that involved Jennifer. As the first traces of daylight crept through the windows, Hayes told Jennifer she had a choice. She could go to the bank and withdraw $15,000, or her daughters would suffer. There was no hesitation. Jennifer agreed. She was untied. Forced into her car. Ordered to drive. It was 9:05 a.m. when Jennifer stepped into the Bank of America in downtown Cheshire. She tried to keep her composure, but the terror in her eyes was impossible to miss. She approached the counter. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was desperation. She requested a withdrawal, $15,000 in cash. She told the teller that her family was being held hostage. That her captors were waiting outside. That if she didn't return quickly, they would be killed. The teller hesitated, trying to process what was happening. Her fingers trembled as she counted out the money, stalling, trying to think. Then, discreetly, she pressed the silent alarm. Behind the counter, the bank manager made the call to 911. 9:21 a.m. The police were now aware of the situation. But outside, Stephen Hayes was growing impatient. Jennifer took the money. She turned. She walked out of the bank. By the time officers arrived, she was already gone. And back inside the Petit home, the nightmare was about to reach its most horrifying chapter. What happened next was pure evil. When Stephen Hayes returned from the bank with Jennifer, she must have believed, if only for a moment, that she had done what was necessary to save her family. She had followed every order. She had cooperated. But her captors had never planned to let them go. As soon as she stepped inside the house, the truth became clear. She was taken to the living room. Forced onto the floor. And there, in those final moments, she was strangled to death by Stephen Hayes. Her daughters, still bound upstairs, had no idea. Haley. Michaela. Two young girls who had already endured unthinkable terror. They were still alive, still tied to their beds, still waiting, praying, that the nightmare would end. But their captors had made a decision. No witnesses. No survivors. They doused the rooms in gasoline. The air filled with the sharp, chemical scent, stinging their eyes, making it hard to breathe. And then, a match. A spark. Flames erupted, racing up the walls, engulfing the furniture, climbing toward the ceiling. The fire spread fast, fueled by the gasoline, devouring everything in its path. And in the chaos, Dr. William Petit, bruised, bleeding, barely conscious, realized this was his only chance. With every ounce of strength he had left, he wrenched his arms free. He stumbled toward the basement stairs, pushing himself forward, ignoring the pain, the dizziness, the pounding in his skull. Smoke was already seeping through the house, the heat growing unbearable. He reached a window, smashed through it, shards of glass tearing at his skin. And then he was outside, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for air. He was alive. But inside, his wife and daughters were not. Haley, disoriented and desperate to escape, somehow freed herself from her bindings. She ran toward the staircase, flames licking at her heels. But the smoke was too thick. The heat too intense. She never made it out. Michaela, still trapped in her bed, had no chance at all. By the time police arrived, the house was an inferno. Firefighters battled the flames, but it was too late. When they finally stepped inside, all they found were ashes. Jennifer's body burned beyond recognition. Haley, just feet from the front door, overcome before she could reach safety. And Michaela, still in her room, her small body curled up in the same place where she had last been alive. A home reduced to nothing. A family destroyed. Dr. William Petit, the only survivor. And two men who had turned a quiet suburban night into one of the most horrific crimes in Connecticut history. Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes didn't get far. As the house burned, police swarmed the scene. The two men attempted to flee in Jennifer's car, speeding away from the fire they had set, but they didn't make it far. A police blockade was waiting. Officers surrounded the vehicle, weapons drawn. The men surrendered without a fight. Inside the car, investigators found damning evidence: cash from the bank, gloves soaked in gasoline, and most chilling of all, Michaela Petit's clothes, taken as a trophy. They were arrested on the spot. But what followed in the courtroom would reveal just how depraved their actions had been. The trial of Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes became one of the most watched and emotionally charged cases in Connecticut history. Every detail that emerged only deepened the horror of what had taken place inside the Petit home. Prosecutors laid out the sequence of events with methodical precision: the stalking at the grocery store, the brutal home invasion, the calculated decision to leave no survivors. Surveillance footage showed Jennifer at the bank, her fear evident as she withdrew the ransom money, unaware that her fate had already been sealed. Crime scene photos showed the aftermath. The charred remains of what had once been a family's home, a place of love and safety turned into a scene of destruction. But what shook the courtroom the most was the testimony. Dr. William Petit took the stand, the sole survivor. The only voice left to speak for his wife and daughters. His words were measured, but the weight of his grief was inescapable. He described the terror of that night, the helplessness of being bound and beaten, the desperate escape that saved his life but left him alone. The defendants, sitting just feet away, showed no remorse. Komisarjevsky, in a chilling display of detachment, claimed that Hayes had taken things too far, that he never intended for anyone to die. But his own diary, found by investigators, told a different story. He had written about the attack in disturbingly casual detail, describing his fixation on Michaela and justifying his actions. Hayes, on the other hand, admitted to everything. But instead of regret, he expressed a desire to die, claiming that prison was a fate worse than death. The jury took little time to reach a decision. In 2010, both men were sentenced to death. But even justice could not undo the unimaginable loss suffered by the Petit family. No verdict could bring back Jennifer, Haley, or Michaela. No punishment could erase the horror of that night. And no sentence could ever answer the question that haunted everyone who heard this case. How could anyone be capable of such cruelty? Dr. William Petit survived. But survival is not the same as living. In the years that followed, he was left to grapple with the unimaginable loss of his wife and daughters. The home they had built together was gone. The life they had shared, destroyed in a single night of unfathomable cruelty. For a long time, he was a man consumed by grief, by survivor's guilt, by the unbearable silence of an empty house. But somehow, against all odds, he found a way forward. Today, Dr. Petit has rebuilt his life in the only way he knows how, by honoring the family he lost. In 2012, he remarried. With his second wife, Christine, he found love again, and together they welcomed a son. A new beginning, though the past will never be forgotten. But perhaps the most enduring tribute to Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela is the Petit Family Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting education, protecting those affected by violence, and helping individuals with chronic illnesses. It is a way of turning unspeakable tragedy into something meaningful, something that gives back to the world, just as Jennifer and the girls always had. Dr. Petit will never forget that night. The scars remain, both visible and unseen. But through his work, through the foundation, through his strength, he has ensured that his family's legacy is one of hope, not just horror. But as we reflect on this case, one question lingers. Could this have been prevented? A call to police was made from the bank while Jennifer was still alive. Could a faster response have saved her? Could more security in the neighborhood have stopped Komisarjevsky and Hayes before they ever entered that home? And most chilling of all, could this happen again? What do you think? Was justice truly served in this case? Could anything have changed the outcome? Let's discuss in the comments below. And if you found this case as shocking as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because more true crime stories are coming your way.